Welcome back. You're still watching Business Morning on Channels Television. As I said just before we went on that quick break, today on the program we're going to be focusing on transforming Nigeria's economy with particular emphasis on the political economy. And I'm being joined on the program by the Managing Director of Cowry Assets and Management Limited, Johnson Chukwu. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with getting a proper understanding of what political economics is all about.
Well, your political economy is the way your the political framework structures makes you to structure your economic framework, because the economy of any country is slightly dependent on the structure of the political framework. And if you look at the Nigerian case, we are running a federal system of government, where you have the federation, the federal government, you have the 36 states, you have Abuja, and then you have the 774 local governments. That's the structure of the economy. But that also influences how our revenue is managed. We have, interestingly, we have a federal system, but we have a centralized revenue management system, which is in conflict or a contradiction to the political framework that we have. And that could be part of the reasons why we say, look, do we have to look at our economic framework to align it with our political framework? Or do we think the current economic framework is the most appropriate given our current environmental and political environment, given the needs of our political environment? So basically what we're looking at is what is the most optimal economic framework or the framework for managing the national economy that will lead to the objectives of the political system, which is, well, equitable distribution of income, even the development of the different parts of the society, giving opportunity to every Nigerian to realize their best of potentials. So those are the factors you have to look at in addressing your socio-political and or political economic environment.
Okay, now you mentioned it already. That's the economic structure that we're presently operating, which is the federalism type of it. And we know that in the 1960s, we had 3 regions and then the federal government, and that has evolved to what we have now. At the time, we were practicing true federalism as well, and that's what we still have now. But looking at the environment and looking at the variables that we have in place at the moment, does it still make sense for us to continue to practice federalism, true federalism?
Well, okay, going back to where you're coming from, in the 60s, what we had, initially we had the 3 regions and we later had 4 regions. The 4 regions formed the federating components of the nation. At that point, we had both a federal system of government in terms of political structure, also in economic structure. The regions generated their revenue. There was also still a part of the federally collected revenue that was going to federation account. As at that time, that was used by the federal government to manage those things that were unitary, like the military, the certain agencies of federal government. But then the regions were relatively autonomous in terms of economic activities. And that was why you had, during that time, it was a glorious time of our political experience, because the regions were growing and developing at a very fast rate.
But what changed?
What changed was the civil war, that the coup, the advent of the military into the government, that led to transformation from a federal system into a unitary system. Of course, what happened was, by the time the military came in, the military by its own nature is a unitary institution. So the military introduced a form of unitary system, particularly with respect to revenue management. And the also matters, by the time oil was discovered in Nigeria in the late 60s, the oil revenue compared or made it imperative at that time, also coming from a time we were coming out of a war, that the federation should have a single pool of revenue. And at that point, the key thing was that we should have even distribution. We should have even development. We shouldn't allow the advent of oil to lead to a kind of an optimal development of the country, where some regions will be developing at the expense of other regions. So that formed the reasons for us to have a federal pool of funds. But unfortunately, the transformation of that process did not take place fast. And therefore, you got to a point where the federation, the federal government had a huge share of the oil revenue, while at the states we are getting peanuts.
Well, that's a very strong topic for debate. So let me just quickly ask you that question, just because I know you're going to already answer it. We're talking about the revenue sharing formula now that is being practiced, and the fact that we are actually operating a federalism kind of federalism state. Now, looking at the way we've actually shared this revenue, and with the advent of the oil boom and all the monies that have come for it, we know that the federal government has a larger share, like you rightly said. But is it right for states that, for instance, do not produce oil to clamor to have a larger share than what they have right now?
Well, that's a very political question. The way I would look at it is this. One of the priorities of any federation is that you should have relatively even development, that you should moderate the level of income inequality, that you should moderate the level of disparity between the regions or between the federating states. Otherwise, you're going to have social upheaval in some states that could spill over to other states. Or you're going to have a massive migration from those states that are backward to those states that are more prosperous. So every federation should aspire to have a relatively even distribution of economic resources to all the federating units, so that you could have a balance, some level of social balance within that environment. Well, if you take it from that perspective, you could actually say that, look, I will look at it from two angles. One, the current revenue sharing formula. Two, the management of the oil revenue. Because those two things are synonymous. They are not synonymous. They are the two major factors that are accounting for the issues that are coming up. So if you look at the issue of whether the states that are not oil producing, you have to look at the abiding law. The law says that every natural resource mined, generated, or under the ground in this country should go, revenue from every natural resource should go to a federation account. So the state that do not have hydrocarbon may also have some other natural resources.
Like limestone.
Like limestone. Okay, and I've had an instance where I was in a debate, a discussion with the governor of one of the northern states, and he said, look, the argument of his people was that they should begin to mine some of the natural resources within their state. And I said, look, you do not have that right, because just the way you agitate that you should share from the oil revenue being mined from the south-south, so are those southern states or every other state in the country entitled to share from oil revenue that will be generated from those solid minerals that are deposited in your states. So the law is such that compels all solid mineral revenue, all revenue generated from items under the soil, to go to a federation account.
Okay.
Irrespective of whether it is crude oil or other solid minerals.
All right.
So in that case, if some states are saying, look, give us more, we have to look at the basis of asking for more. But in effect, what most states are asking for is that the amount that goes to the federal government should be reduced in favor of the states. So in that case, it may not necessarily mean that take from those oil producing states and give to the non-oil producing states. They're just saying that reduce what goes to the federation, because the amount that goes to the federal government is so huge, and there's so much concentration on economic resources.
Yeah, what they're actually advocating for is that the federal government should get about 30%.
Absolutely.
The states should get 42%, and local governments should take 28%. Exactly. Now, I agree with this, your argument that all the states in Nigeria have good potentials, very viable potentials, and we saw all of that in the early 60s, down even into the 70s and the 80s. All of that has changed. You say now that if you have a natural resource in your own state, you have to get the federal right. It doesn't belong to the state, it belongs to the federal government. But before we begin to even talk about these natural resources, there are other ways that the states have actually run themselves and not necessarily had to depend on the federal allocations from the government. They had agriculture, and in fact, most of them were actually, heavy into agriculture and every other this thing, collecting taxes and the rest of it. So what has changed in all of that? Why has all of a sudden everybody shifted from paying attention to what can be economically viable in their states to waiting for when the federal accounts will disburse monies to them. And that's recently caused a lot of ripples, because some of the monies, in fact, for July and August, the monies were not up to what should have been disbursed to them, about 75 billion naira short or thereabout. And there's been so much furore about all of this, that they can't pay overhead, they can't pay salaries, they can't run the government the way they're supposed to be running it. Should they always have to wait for money to come from the Federation accounts?
Well, I think that should be the crux of the discussion. You see, my perspective on this is that we should review the current revenue allocation system and move away from a centralized revenue management to a federal system of revenue management, or what they call fiscal federalism, such that each of the federal units will manage resources within its own domain and contribute part of the resource that it generates into the federal pool. From that federal pool, the federal government can now grant some level of subsidy to states that are having difficulties. So, but that subsidy, and the way it should work is this: if you have a fiscal federalism, each state will manage resources at its own disposal.
These resources we're talking about, they're natural resources.
It could be natural resources. But beyond natural resources, let me tell you the way human beings work. The ingenuity of all the states, virtually every state has some level of natural resources. Some of those resources are unexploited. But beyond that, what the huge deposit of government has caused in the country, that we have begun to ignore those other human capital resources that will actually grow, that actually should be the focus of economic development. And the beauty of having a fiscal federalism is this: for the states that do not have enough resources, they will be creative. We've seen situations like that. We saw in Cross River State, where the former Cross River State Governor Donald Duke said, look, we do not have a lot of hydrocarbon deposits, but we're going to turn our state into a tourist center because our people are naturally amiable people. And then he was able to turn, within an 8-year period, Cross River State into a tourist center. Other states have the same. Bauchi State has a Yankari game reserve and several other things. When I was a very young boy, people, from family members, were going to Yankari on holidays. But I don't know if anybody does that today. So we allowed those comparative advantages the states have to die because the states go cap in hand and collect revenue that they did not sweat for. And I want to highlight something to you. If you have fiscal federalism, the governance in the states will improve, because the governments in those states will have to rely on tax revenue. Well, by relying on tax revenue, they're going to make the citizens to demand for accountability. And the citizens will also be alive to their civil responsibility of electing the most qualified people to govern them. But beyond that, if you know that you're going to rely on tax revenue, you will invest in infrastructure so that the economic activities in your state will grow, so that your citizens will have more revenue to pay you tax.
But then you see, there's also this argument that states can only earn revenue from payee, because corporate tax and customs duty goes to the center, which is the federal government. But we're going to talk about all of that in just a moment. We'll take a quick break now on the program, and when we come back, we're still focusing on the political economy and how it can transform Nigeria's economy to where it should be. And I'm talking with the Managing Director of Cowry Assets and Management Limited, Johnson Chukwu. We'll be right back.